In intelligence work, victories are measured in secrets kept. Failures are measured in allies lost. In 1979, Mossad did not lose a battle. It lost an entire country. Iran, once Israel's most powerful, most secret Middle Eastern partner, vanished behind a wall of fire, chants, and revolution. And inside Tel Aviv, veteran intelligence officers watched years of covert cooperation collapse in a matter of weeks. This is not the story of an assassination. It is the story of a disappearance, of how Mossad lost Iran. On January 16, 1979, the winter air over Tehran was thin and colorless as Mohammad Reza Pahlavi stepped onto the tarmac at Mehrabad Airport. The Shah of Iran wore his uniform with practiced precision, but nothing about this moment resembled ceremony. There were no crowds cheering, no military bands, no declarations of triumph. Only silence, broken by the low hum of aircraft engines and the weight of something ending. As he paused at the foot of the stairs, the Shah turned briefly toward the city he had ruled for nearly 4 decades. His face was calm, but those who knew him understood what that stillness meant. He was leaving Iran, and somewhere deep inside, he knew he would never return. Inside Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, the moment did not feel distant. It felt immediate, almost physical. Senior officers gathered around radios and secure lines, listening as reports confirmed what had long been feared. The Shah's departure was not a tactical retreat. It was collapse. For Israel's intelligence service, this was not merely the fall of a foreign monarch. It was the sudden disappearance of Israel, its most valuable and most secret ally in the Middle East. For nearly 30 years, Iran had existed as Israel's unseen strategic partner. Publicly, Tehran maintained a careful ambiguity, but privately the relationship was deep, deliberate, and immensely valuable. Iranian oil flowed quietly to Israel when Arab embargoes tightened. Israeli weapons and technology moved in the opposite direction. Intelligence passed between Tehran and Tel Aviv, with a level of trust Israel shared with almost no one else in the region. Mossad officers operated in Iran not as intruders, but as collaborators. They trained Iranian intelligence, advised counterinsurgency units, and shared sensitive assessments about Arab armies, Palestinian militant groups, and Soviet expansion. This alliance had been born in secrecy in the early years after Israel's founding, when survival depended on unconventional friendships. Iran, a non-Arab Muslim power ruled by a fiercely anti-communist Shah, saw Israel not as an enemy but as a useful partner against shared threats. Egypt's pan-Arab nationalism, Syria's hostility, and Moscow's shadow all pushed Tehran and Jerusalem closer together. By the 1960s, the partnership was so normalized behind closed doors that Mossad officers spoke of Tehran as one of their safest foreign postings. Yet beneath the surface, the ground had been shifting. By early 1978, Mossad analysts began noticing cracks in the Shah's grip on power. Reports from Tehran described growing unrest, initially dismissed by Iranian officials as manageable protests. But Mossad's experience with revolutionary movements told a different story. Demonstrations were spreading beyond students and intellectuals, pulling in merchants, clerics, and entire neighborhoods. This was no longer isolated dissent. It was mass mobilization. At the center of it all was a man in exile, an aging cleric whose voice reached Iran through smuggled cassette tapes. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini spoke not in the language of reform, but of absolute transformation. He framed the Shah not merely as a flawed ruler, but as illegitimate, corrupt, and un-Islamic. Mossad translated every speech, tracked every distribution route, and warned that Khomeini's appeal cut deeper than previous opposition figures. This was ideological warfare, and it was spreading faster than bullets. The Shah refused to see it. Surrounded by loyalists and reassured by the strength of his military, he believed control could be restored. Savak, the powerful intelligence service Mossad had helped build, was still intact. Tanks still rolled, generals still saluted. To the Shah, this was noise, not revolution. But Mossad officers on the ground felt the atmosphere changing. Iranian counterparts who had once been open and cooperative became guarded. Meetings were postponed or canceled altogether. Some contacts disappeared without explanation. Surveillance increased, not just by the state, but by ordinary citizens who now watched foreigners with suspicion. Tehran no longer felt stable. It felt brittle. By late 1978, Mossad faced an uncomfortable reality. They were watching a revolution form in real time, and their ally was blind to it. Worse still, Israel had no alternative power center inside Iran. Its relationship was tied almost entirely to the Shah and the institutions loyal to him. If he fell, the alliance would fall with him. In December, Mossad quietly began contingency planning. Israeli families were encouraged to leave under the guise of routine travel. Business personnel followed. Intelligence officers stayed behind, maintaining cover and gathering what information they could, knowing that once they left, they might never return. Files were reviewed, sensitive assets prepared for destruction if necessary. The assumption was no longer whether the Shah could survive, but how quickly the collapse would come. When the Shah finally boarded that plane in January, events accelerated beyond even Mossad's most pessimistic projections. Within weeks, Khomeini returned to Tehran to a reception that stunned the world. Millions filled the streets. The monarchy unraveled without a decisive battle. Institutions that had seemed immovable dissolved almost overnight. For Mossad, there was no dramatic final confrontation. No firefights, no arrests. Just the slow realization that the ground beneath them no longer existed. Orders came to shut down operations, sever contacts, and leave. Equipment was abandoned. Files were burned. Iranian allies who had worked with Israel for years suddenly became liabilities, and many would pay for those associations with their freedom or their lives. When the Islamic Republic of Iran was declared, Israel vanished from Iran's official reality. The Israeli embassy was seized. Diplomatic recognition erased. Slogans replaced cooperation, and hostility replaced silence. What had once been Israel's strongest regional partner transformed into one of its most committed adversaries. Inside Mossad, the loss cut deeply. This was not a failed mission. It was a strategic catastrophe decades in the making. An intelligence service built to anticipate threats had been unable to prevent, or even soften, the most consequential political reversal in its history. And as Iran's new rulers consolidated power, one truth became unavoidable. The story was far from over. The end of the alliance was only the beginning of a much longer conflict. When Mossad's last officers slipped out of Tehran, they did not leave behind a closed chapter. They left behind a vacuum. And history has a way of rushing violently into empty space. In the first weeks after the Islamic Republic declared itself victorious, confusion ruled Iran. Revolutionary committees replaced ministries. Former generals disappeared. Savak, once feared and omnipresent, was dismantled almost overnight. Its prisons opened, its officers hunted. To many Iranians, this felt like liberation. To Mossad analysts watching from afar, it felt like something far more dangerous, a state rebuilding itself with rage as its foundation. Inside Israel's intelligence community, there was an unspoken fear that no one wanted to articulate aloud. Iran was not simply changing governments, it was changing identity. The clerics who now held power were not pragmatic nationalists or rival strongmen who could be bargained with in secret. They were ideological absolutists. And at the center of that ideology was a worldview in which Israel was not an inconvenient neighbor, but an illegitimate entity. For decades, Mossad had understood Iran through the Shah's lens. Calculating, strategic, self-interested. That framework no longer applied. The men now shaping Iran's future had grown up despising everything the Shah represented: Western alignment, secular authority, and covert cooperation with Israel. To them, Mossad was not a partner that had lost influence. It was an enemy that had infiltrated Iran's soul. In the spring of 1979, Mossad began receiving fragmented intelligence from former Iranian contacts who had managed to flee. Their accounts painted a grim picture. Revolutionary tribunals operated day and night. Confessions were extracted. Lists were compiled. Anyone connected to the old regime, or worse, to Israel, was marked. Some contacts vanished mid-conversation. Others sent frantic messages and then went silent forever. Mossad officers who had worked closely with Iranian counterparts for years now carried a quiet burden. They knew that relationships built on trust had become death sentences for the people left behind. Intelligence, once exchanged freely, had turned toxic. Meanwhile, in Tehran, the revolution hardened. Ayatollah Khomeini moved quickly to eliminate rivals. Moderates were sidelined. Leftist groups that had helped destabilize the Shah were crushed. Power consolidated around the clerical core, and with consolidation came clarity. Israel was named openly, repeatedly, as an enemy of Islam. Not as rhetoric, but as doctrine. This shift stunned even seasoned intelligence veterans. Mossad had long prepared for hostility from Arab states. It had not fully prepared for a non-Arab power with Iran's size, resources, and revolutionary fervor to place Israel at the center of its ideological universe. By late 1979, Israeli analysts began noticing a pattern. Iranian operatives were reaching outward, quietly at first, then more boldly. Contacts were established with Palestinian militant groups that had once been suppressed by the Shah. Training camps received new funding. Weapon shipments appeared in places they had not before. What had once been Iran's quiet cooperation with Israel was being inverted into active resistance. The most alarming development came with the hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in November 1979. To the world, it was an anti-American spectacle. To Mossad, it was proof of something deeper. The Islamic Republic was not interested in diplomatic norms or international restraint. It thrived on confrontation. Chaos was not a side effect, it was leverage. Inside Mossad, a painful reassessment began. How had they misread this moment so profoundly? The intelligence on unrest had been accurate. The analysis of the Shah's weakness had been correct. But the speed and totality of the ideological transformation had exceeded expectations. Mossad had prepared for instability, not inversion. Iran was no longer a neutralized asset. It was becoming an engine. By 1980, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Iranian support for militant networks began reshaping the region. Lebanon, already fragile, became a focal point. Shiite communities long marginalized found new backing, new funding, and new purpose. Israel's northern border grew more volatile by the month. For Mossad, this was the most bitter irony of all. The agency that had once helped Iran build its intelligence apparatus now faced a version of Iran that had learned from its enemies. The new regime absorbed techniques, exploited regional grievances, and weaponized ideology with frightening efficiency. Within Israeli leadership circles, the question was no longer whether Iran could be contained. It was whether Israel had any visibility left inside a country that had once been one of its most accessible intelligence environments. The answer was bleak. Iran closed itself off. Western intelligence networks were purged. Surveillance intensified. Counterintelligence grew ruthless. The new regime understood paranoia as a survival tool, and it wielded it expertly. Mossad, once comfortable operating in Tehran's social and political spaces, now found the country nearly impenetrable. This loss of access had cascading effects. Israel no longer had early warning from the east, no friendly intelligence service to share regional assessments, no quiet back channel to influence events beyond its borders. Iran's transformation shifted Israel's strategic horizon overnight, and then came war. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, believing the revolutionary regime was weak. For Mossad, the conflict presented a grim calculation. A hostile Iran was dangerous. A victorious, emboldened Iran could be catastrophic. Yet Saddam's Iraq was hardly a preferable alternative. The Middle East was entering a phase where every outcome carried risk. In this new reality, Mossad had to reinvent its approach. The era of partnership was over. The era of long-term confrontation had begun. But even as Israel adjusted, the deeper psychological impact lingered. Losing Iran was not just losing an ally. It was losing strategic imagination. The belief that unconventional relationships could defy regional norms. That belief had once been Mossad's greatest strength. Now it felt like a relic. And as the 1980s unfolded, the consequences of that loss would ripple outward, shaping conflicts, proxy wars, and covert battles that would define the Middle East for generations. The loss of Iran forced Mossad into a dangerous psychological transition. For decades, Israeli intelligence had operated from a position of quiet reach, surrounded by enemies, yes, but buffered by hidden partnerships that extended Israel's vision far beyond its borders. Iran had been the most important of those buffers. When it vanished, Mossad did not simply lose files, stations, or sources. It lost strategic depth, and the Middle East has never been forgiving to those who lose depth. By the early 1980s, it became clear that Iran's revolution was not burning itself out, nor was it softening with time. Instead, it was institutionalizing hostility. The new Islamic Republic began exporting its ideology deliberately, seeing regional instability not as a threat, but as an opportunity. For Mossad analysts, the pattern was unmistakable. Where Iran once shared intelligence on Palestinian factions, it now funded and trained them. Where it once feared radical militancy, it now cultivated it. Lebanon became the proving ground. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 was driven by immediate security concerns, but beneath the surface lay a deeper anxiety. Iranian influence was seeping into southern Lebanon through Shiite networks that had long felt abandoned and powerless. Iranian Revolutionary Guard advisors arrived quietly, embedding themselves in training camps in the Bekaa Valley. What emerged from that partnership was not just another militia, but something new, disciplined, ideological, and patient. Hezbollah. For Mossad, this was a moment of grim recognition. The organization forming on Israel's northern border bore the fingerprints of Iranian strategic thinking. It was decentralized, resilient, and built for the long war. This was not a group designed for quick victories. It was designed to endure, to bleed its enemies slowly, and to survive setbacks without collapsing. The irony cut deep. Mossad officers understood Iranian intelligence culture intimately. They had helped shape parts of it during the Shah's era. Now they were watching that same culture re-emerge in hostile form, adapted to revolutionary ideology, and stripped of any restraint. Inside Mossad, a new generation of officers began studying Iran not as a lost partner, but as a permanent adversary. This required a fundamental shift in mindset. Iran was no longer a state whose behavior could be influenced through pragmatism or mutual interest. It was a state that defined itself through opposition. Intelligence assessments became darker, more cautious. Optimism disappeared from the language. Yet penetrating Iran proved far more difficult than anyone anticipated. The Islamic Republic learned quickly from the Shah's mistakes. Foreign intelligence services were treated not as abstract threats, but as existential dangers. Counterintelligence units expanded. Internal surveillance became relentless. Revolutionary ideology provided moral justification for paranoia, and paranoia proved remarkably effective. Informants were rewarded lavishly. Suspicions were acted upon ruthlessly. For Mossad, traditional recruitment methods failed again and again. Fear was simply too strong, the cost of cooperation too high. Even Iranians who disliked the regime hesitated, knowing that betrayal was rarely forgiven and never forgotten. By the mid-1980s, Israel faced a sobering reality. Iran was influencing events across the Middle East, yet remained largely opaque. Intelligence gaps widened. Decisions had to be made with incomplete information, and in intelligence work, uncertainty is often more dangerous than bad information. This strategic blindness coincided with another painful development. Iran was no longer content to wage war through proxies alone. It began pursuing capabilities that could shift the balance of power permanently. Among them, missile technology and eventually nuclear research. Mossad understood the implications immediately. A revolutionary state driven by ideological hostility, equipped with long-range weapons, was an entirely different kind of threat than the Iran of the Shah. Containment was no longer enough. Prevention became the objective. But prevention without access is a brutal challenge. The agency adapted by expanding its operations beyond Iran's borders. Iranian scientists were tracked abroad. Supply chains were mapped in Europe and Asia. Front companies were identified. Sabotage replaced persuasion. Assassination replaced diplomacy. This period marked the beginning of Mossad's longest covert campaign, one not against a single individual or organization, but against a state's future capabilities. Every operation carried echoes of what had been lost. Had Iran remained an ally, none of this would have been necessary. Instead, Mossad found itself fighting a shadow war with a country it once trusted more than any other in the region. Within Israeli political circles, debates intensified. Some argued that Mossad and Israeli leadership had overinvested in the Shah, mistaking stability for permanence. Others insisted that no intelligence service could have prevented such a seismic ideological shift. Both sides were partly right. Intelligence can illuminate risks, but it cannot force leaders or societies to act against their own momentum. What haunted Mossad most was not the revolution itself, but its completeness. There had been no internal faction willing or able to preserve even a fragment of the old relationship. The rupture was total. Iran did not merely turn away from Israel, it defined itself against it. By the late 1980s, this new reality was embedded in Israeli doctrine. Iran replaced traditional Arab state armies as the primary long-term threat. Resources shifted accordingly. Entire departments within Mossad were reorganized around Iranian targets. Analysts who once specialized in Tehran's political elite now tracked clerics, guards commanders, and shadow financiers. The loss of Iran reshaped Mossad's identity. It reinforced a lesson learned repeatedly in Israel's history, but never fully absorbed. Alliances built in secrecy are powerful, but fragile. When they collapse silently, leaving no public record, only consequences. And those consequences were now visible everywhere. In Lebanon's escalating violence, in the proliferation of Iranian-backed networks, in the growing sense that Israel was no longer facing a ring of conventional enemies, but a web of ideological adversaries stretching across borders. By the time the Cold War began to end, Mossad found itself confronting a paradox. The global system that had once enabled covert alliances was dissolving, yet Iran's hostility remained constant. The world was changing. The conflict was not. What had begun in 1979 as the loss of a monarch had evolved into something far more enduring, the birth of a strategic rivalry with no clear endpoint. And for Mossad, the question was no longer how Iran was lost, but whether the damage done in those months could ever truly be undone. By the time the 1990s arrived, Mossad no longer spoke of Iran as a former ally. That language had been erased. Inside the agency, Iran was now referred to as the Long War, an adversary defined not by borders, but by persistence. The generation of officers who had once walked freely through Tehran, who drank tea with Iranian counterparts and debated regional threats late into the night, were retiring. In their place stood a new cadre who knew Iran only as an enemy, distant, ideological, and relentlessly patient. What made this rivalry uniquely dangerous was memory. Iran remembered the years of cooperation just as vividly as Mossad did, but from the opposite emotional direction. To the Islamic Republic, the Shah's alliance with Israel was not merely a political mistake. It was a betrayal of faith, identity, and sovereignty. Mossad was woven into that narrative as a symbol of corruption and foreign manipulation. Every covert Israeli operation uncovered, every rumor whispered, reinforced the regime's belief that vigilance and hostility were justified. This emotional legacy shaped Iran's intelligence culture. Counterintelligence became obsessive. Foreign influence was treated as contamination. Even internal dissent was framed as an extension of Mossad plots. Over time, this paranoia hardened into policy, creating a security state that was deeply suspicious, but also deeply disciplined. For Mossad, this meant that mistakes became costlier, windows of opportunity narrower, and success harder to verify. Yet Mossad adapted as it always had. Denied access inside Iran, it focused outward. Iranian diplomats, businessmen, scientists, and intermediaries became points of observation. Patterns were built slowly, sometimes over years. Operations grew quieter, more compartmentalized. Nothing was rushed. The scars of 1979 lingered, reminding decision-makers what happened when history moved faster than intelligence. One of the most profound consequences of losing Iran was the reshaping of Mossad's philosophy. During the Shah's era, intelligence had been about influence, guiding allies, sharing assessments, shaping outcomes discreetly. After the revolution, intelligence became about disruption. If Mossad could not shape Iran's intentions, it would obstruct its capabilities. This shift defined decades of covert action. But disruption has limits. Sabotage can delay, assassinations can intimidate, and cyber operations can confuse. But none of them restore what was lost in 1979: strategic trust. Without that trust, every action carried the risk of escalation. Every success risked retaliation through proxies. Every failure risked exposure that could ignite wider conflict. This balancing act defined Mossad's relationship with Iran through the end of the century and beyond. Iran armed and financed militant networks across the region, extending its reach without exposing itself directly. Mossad countered by targeting the connective tissue: financiers, logisticians, engineers. It was a war of shadows, fought far from headlines where victories were invisible and losses often denied. Inside Israel, policymakers gradually came to understand that the Iranian Revolution had altered the country's security reality more profoundly than any conventional war. Egypt could sign peace treaties. Jordan could normalize relations. Even former enemies could become quiet neighbors. Iran could not. Its hostility was not negotiable because it was existential, woven into the regime's legitimacy. And so the loss of Iran became more than a historical episode. It became a cautionary tale. Within Mossad training rooms, the story of pre-1979 Iran was studied carefully, not with nostalgia, but with discipline. Officers were taught how intelligence can succeed tactically and still fail strategically, how proximity to power can breed false confidence, how revolutions are not always loud until they are unstoppable. The Shah had believed himself secure because institutions stood behind him. Mossad had believed the alliance was durable because interests aligned. Both underestimated belief, and belief, once mobilized, proved stronger than tanks, intelligence files, or decades of cooperation. In the end, Mossad did not lose Iran in a single moment. It lost Iran through a series of assumptions that history quietly invalidated. Assumptions about stability, about control, about the limits of ideology. Today, when Mossad assesses threats across the Middle East, the shadow of 1979 is always present. Every alliance is questioned. Every partner is tested against the lesson Iran left behind. That secrecy can protect relationships, but it cannot save them from transformation. Iran remains one of Mossad's most complex adversaries, not because of its power alone, but because of intimacy lost. Few intelligence services are forced to confront an enemy they once knew so well. Fewer still must fight one that learned from the same playbook. The Iranian Revolution did more than end an alliance. It inverted it. It turned a pillar of Israel's hidden security architecture into a central pillar of its long-term threat landscape. And for Mossad, the greatest loss was not access or oil or intelligence networks. It was certainty. The certainty that some relationships, once built, could endure. That illusion died in 1979, on a cold January afternoon, as a plane lifted off from Tehran, carrying a king into exile and an alliance into history.